What is the mark of a great warrior? Is it physical strength? Is it size? Is it skills with the various weapons of war? Or is it something else entirely? Well, today we are going to see just what the ancient Japanese thought made an exquisite, excellent warrior. Yokoso owashitare. Welcome back to another story. And if you like ancient Japanese storytelling, ancient Japanese culture and history, or just storytelling in general, please don't forget to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's get into the story. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi, there was a man who was the governor of Kawauchi, a man by the name of Minamoto no Yorinobu. He was the third son of the Mitsunaka Nyudo, which means that he was the brother to Minamoto no Yorimitsu, whom we saw a couple of videos ago. Now this Yorinobu was an exquisite, excellent warrior. He followed the warrior's path with all reverence and diligence. He was so effective in his job that he was relied upon by the court and the emperor to do anything that they needed in regards to military service or strongmen or things of the like. And because of this, the court and the emperor heaped titles and lands upon him, gave him all sorts of privileges. And because of this, the public at large actually very much respected and even feared him, because he was not only a very high-ranking nobleman in the Heian court, but he was also a powerful, very excellent, skilled warrior. But there came a time when Yorinobu became the governor, no longer of Kawachi, but of the province of Hitachi, far off in the eastern part of the country. And after he had situated himself there, he became aware of another warrior who lived in the area, a man by the name of Taira no Tadatsune. Now this Taira no Tadatsune was also a very excellent warrior, and he had tons and tons, huge hordes of men who followed underneath his banner. And because of this, Taira no Tadatsune pretty much wandered around the provinces of Kazusa and Shimousa, both of which were provinces that were out in the east next to Hitachi, and he did whatever he wanted. Because he had such excellent fighting forces, nobody could challenge him whenever he wanted to do something. And also, he had a very nasty habit of ignoring the decrees from the emperor, not paying his taxes, not keeping the peace, and just doing everything according to his will, and disregarding anybody else's input. Now, when the main character of our story, Yorinobu, heard about this, he of course was understandably less than enthused by this news, and so he decided he was going to attack Tadatsune and make sure he was put in his place and brought to heel. And so to accomplish his purposes, he employed another man of the same warrior family, the Taira clan, who held the position of Saemon Taifu, and whose name was Taira no Koremoto. Now this man was also a very wise, very excellent leader of war. And so our main character Yorinobu turned to this Koremoto guy, who was from the same clan as the enemy he was trying to defeat, and asked his opinion. How do you think we should go about attacking this man? What do you think we should do? And this Koremoto gave a very astute, very obvious answer. He simply said, well, Tadatsune is a very powerful warrior with plenty and plenty of men at his command. Furthermore, it is very difficult to reach his residence. It's not something that we can just take an army there and overrun. And therefore, I think it would be wise to bide our time a little bit, to gather as many forces as we could, as many men as we possibly can, and attack him when we have such an overwhelming force that even the most powerful of warriors in the most advantageous of situations couldn't possibly hope to win. And Yorinobu heard this, and he thought about it for a second, and he simply said, "You have an excellent point. However, I cannot abide this man doing as he pleases any longer. This problem needs to be solved now." And so with that being said, he sent this Koremoto, this guy with whom he was conversing, out to go gather forces and to meet him at the place of rendezvous later with as many men as he could possibly muster. And Koremoto did just that. He fulfilled his obligations. He went out and gathered about 3,000 men. Now you have to remember at this time, the warriors were largely comprised of very elite horseback archers, but they did not field massive armies. Instead, their armies usually were in the range of a few hundred to maybe 1,000. So the fact that this Koremoto was able to go out and gather 3,000 men was super impressive. But he brought his men to the place of rendezvous, which was Kashima Jingu, modern-day Kashima Jingu, which I've been to, and I very much enjoyed, and it's also very fitting because Kashima Jingu is dedicated to one of the most important warrior gods in Japanese mythology. And there Koremoto waited for our main character Yorinobu to arrive with his men, and eventually they showed up and combined forces. And Yorinobu had brought 2,000 of his men and combined them with Koremoto's 3,000, together making about 5,000 men. And here the story gets really descriptive in talking about the sheer grandeur of this army. Like, this army was second to none. It says that the army extended for about 20 cho in length, a cho being about 100 meters or 100 yards or so. So these men went on for about 2,000 yards, just spread out over the white sands of the beach next to this Shinto shrine dedicated to a god of war. And their armor and their bows and everything that they had gleamed in the sunlight with a sheen that it was almost like the morning midday sun had actually come down and was amongst them itself. And anybody who was looking out across the beach, to them it almost seemed like the very clouds were slowly drifting across the land with how big this army was. And there were many people who were there who were awestruck by this, and how it seemed like this army had come straight out of a fairy tale. Like it came from one of the ancient myths back in the Age of the Gods when such massive armies were written about. Needless to say, everybody was just astounded. And so, having gathered their forces at Kashima, everybody eventually moved out. Only there was a problem. In order to get to whom they were trying to attack, they actually had to go across a massive inlet, a big bay, or some kind of a massive lake. Specifically, this was the mouth of the Koromo River. And if you were standing on the side that they were on and looking over to the side that they were trying to get to, it was so far that you couldn't even see another person's face on the opposite side. However, that is where Tadatsune's home was. That's where his base was, and they needed to get over there. Now, there were two ways of getting there. One, they could take the more obvious route and go around this big inlet, this big lake, or this big river mouth. However, that was a bit problematic because that would take so long. Specifically, the text says that it would take about 7 days. I don't know if technically that means they would have to go far upriver to find a place where they could actually ford the river with their massive armies and their horses and all their supplies and everything. But there was one other way of getting across, and that was to take boats directly across, which if they did, they could get across in 1 day very easily. But the problem was, because Tadatsune was such a powerful man in the region, he had actually taken all of the boats in the area and hid them somewhere where nobody could find them. So these men, Yorinobu, had no way of ferrying 5,000 men across this massive body of water. And so as the men were sitting there discussing about how they were going to attack Tadatsune, everybody basically came to the conclusion that they didn't really have a choice. They were going to have to go around this body of water. And unfortunately, that means that the enemy would have time to prepare defenses and or escape, but there wasn't really any other option, so I guess we'll just go ahead and do that. However, Yorinobu wanted to try one thing real quick, and he called to his side a man by the name of O Nakatomi Narihira. And he got a single small boat for this man, because I guess there was at least some small boats hanging around that they could use, not enough to ferry across an entire army, but just, a small one that maybe a handful of people could go across, or in this case, a single man. And so Yorinobu came to this man Narihira, and he told him, I want you to go over to Tadatsune, and I want you to deliver a message. Or rather, instead of delivering a message, I want you to double check and see if he does intend to actually fight us. Looking at the size of our army, he might actually get cold feet and just simply surrender. So I want you to go over there. And if he is willing to surrender, I'm sure he would be happy to let you go, and we'll just have you immediately come back by boat, and none will be the wiser. However, if he does not want to surrender, what I want you to do is I want you to send the boat down the river, and we will see this and know that yes, he does intend to fight, and that we have no other choice but to attack him. And Narihira, being a very brave soldier himself, immediately accepted this mission and took off in this boat directly toward the enemy. And now the text here tries really hard to impress upon you just how massive this army was, just how rare this kind of a force was. And it talks about how, at this point, Koremoto got off of his horse and went over and began leading the horse of Yorinobu, his lord in this case. Now, I'm not sure why this next part happens, but when all of the rest of the army saw this, they all felt that they ought to get off their horses too, and with one accord everybody dismounted. However, because there were so many people, the text talks about how it looked like the wind was blowing across the grass, and how a massive sound came from just these warriors all getting off their horses and landing on the ground at once. Again, impressing upon you just how massive this army was. This was kind of a force that was not seen in Japan almost ever up until this point. And after some time passed, sure enough, a single boat came sailing down the river. And that was the sign that Tadatsune had zero intent to surrender, that they were indeed going to have to attack. But the boat did come with a message. I don't know if it was in the form of a messenger or in the form of a letter or whatnot, but it did have a message from Tadatsune. And he said something to the effect of, "Lord Governor, you are indeed a very elegant and noble man. And although it would be most appropriate for me to come before you and greet you myself, unfortunately, our ancestors were enemies from long ago, and therefore it would be a shame for me to come and kneel before you. I, unfortunately, cannot accept the terms of surrender." Now, of course, this meant that they had to attack. And he turned to his men and he said, "Men, if we were to go around this body of water, it would take us many, many days, which would give the enemy plenty of time to prepare defenses or to escape. Therefore, it would be in our best interest to attack them today. They would not be expecting it, and we could catch them unawares and take the victory so very easily. However, there are no boats for us to ferry our armies across. What do you think we should do?" And all of the men kind of just looked at each other a little bit, and they turned to the Lord and they said, "But my Lord, there really is no other option. The only way we can attack them is if we go around. There's no way for us to get across this body of water." And upon hearing this, the governor Yorinobu broke into a knowing grin, and he told his men, "My men, this is the first time I have been in this eastern Bando region." By the way, Bando is the name of this region of the east, "and I do not know my ways around these lands. However, there is a saying that was passed down in my family, who has lived amongst here, that in this body of water, there is a very shallow path that leads from this shore to the opposite one. There's a section of land about 1 jol in length, which is about 3 yards or 3 meters, where the water only comes up to about the underside of the horses. If we can find this path, we can attack them today without fear and take them by surprise and get the victory. However, again, I am new to these parts, and so I ask any of my men out there, does anybody know of the pathway that leads from this shore to the opposite one? If there is anybody among you who knows this pathway, I will have him go before me and lead the way for our armies to gain the victory." And after that, he sent out messengers through his ranks to go see if anybody knew this pathway. And sure enough, one man stepped forward, a man by the name of Makami no Takafumi. And he said, "My lord, I have roamed these paths for many, many years, and I believe I know the way. Please, allow me." And with that, he grabbed a bundle of reeds, long pole-like sticks, and he had a servant of his carry them, and he went forth with this servant following behind him. And as he went, he had his servant stick these reeds into the submerged earth underneath, and thus he was able to create a path for the rest of the army to go through. Now, there were about 2 places that the horses needed to actually swim, but for the most part, the path went cleanly from one end of the shore to the other. And so immediately seeing this, all of the other men went in orderly fashion and started going across this pathway. And after about 500 or so of them made their way across, Yorinobu himself went out and followed them. Now the text then points out that in this entire army of about 5,000 men, there were probably only 3 of them who knew of this secret pathway, and nobody else had ever even heard that it existed, let alone know where it actually was. And this actually astounded most of the men who were actually locals. They had been around here, and they had lived here their whole lives for years and years and years. And they were absolutely amazed that a man who was from the capital, or rather who was from the western part of the country, despite never setting foot here before, had such intimate knowledge of the land that he knew about this secret pathway across the water. And they all marveled that he was no ordinary man. He was no ordinary warrior. He was a very wise, very learned, very skilled man, and they were more than happy to follow him to victory. Now on the other shore, Tadatsune was feeling very pleased with himself. There was zero chance that Yorinobu was going to be able to make his way around the lake in order to attack him. He had plenty of time. He didn't really need to worry about it. He could put up defenses. If they really needed to, they could book it. But he was fine. Now, he did know about this secret pathway, but he was positive. There was no way Yorinobu, some Western warrior, was going to know anything about this. He sincerely believed that he was the only one who knew about it, and believed that nobody could ever find it. And as he was sitting there with his army at his side, because he wanted them there just in case, but as he was sitting there feeling very pleased with himself, suddenly one of his men ran in, out of breath and shaking, and he announced to the whole army, "The governor of Hitachi has found the shallow pathway across the bay. He is on his way here now. What do we do?" And he said this with fright in his voice. He was obviously very, very distressed, and so Tadatsune was positive this was not a joke. This man had likely seen it with his own eyes, and this completely blew Tadatsune's mind. It went against everything he had assumed and prepared for. Because he had prepared, he had his army there, but he was not expecting Yorinobu to come from the bay side. No, there was no way he could have done that. And yet, he went out to go see, and sure enough, there was Yorinobu's army pretty much all the way across the bay at this point. And after taking a moment to be shocked and realizing the dire situation that he was actually in, Tadatsune simply said, "Well, we've been had, gentlemen. There's nothing we can do. Absolutely nothing we can do. And so, I suppose we have no choice but to concede." And with that, Tadatsune had a letter of surrender written up, and he sent it out with all of the appropriate entourage and with all the appropriate decorations and propriety, and he formally declared surrender. And he sent a single man out on a boat to go meet Yorinobu and his army and give him this message. Now, that was a bit concerning, because at this point Tadatsune was at the mercy of Yorinobu. If Yorinobu wanted to, he could still attack, and he could still defeat and potentially even execute Tadatsune, if he so desired. He clearly had the advantage here. He had a massive army, he was basically at his doorstep. There was nothing Tadatsune could hope to do if Yorinobu decided to attack. And maybe he would. Maybe he was fed up with Tadatsune. Maybe he didn't trust that he was going to surrender, or that after he surrendered he was immediately going to revert to his irresponsible ways. And so, he really just had to throw himself at the mercy of Yorinobu. And at this point, Yorinobu had a choice. I mean, he had just marshaled 5,000 men, an army bigger than any the country had seen in centuries. And this could potentially be his moment of glory and victory, where he went and he, with his legendarily massive army, slayed an enemy to the court. However, Yorinobu was above that. He was a wise man, a cunning man, a shrewd man, and he knew that in this instance it would be better to treat his enemies with mercy and compassion than with brute, uncompromising violence. And so after Yorinobu received these official surrender declarations, he turned to his men and he said, "Well, men, they have officially surrendered, and it would be unbecoming of us to attack a man while he is down. So, as he has capitulated, let us all return home without shedding any blood." And that was that. With the command being given by Yorinobu, all of the men went back to where they came from, they turned their horses around, they went back across the bay, and they dispersed. Everybody went home. And now some of you may be thinking, Well, that was really anticlimactic. I was hoping there was going to be war. I was hoping there was going to be swords clashing together. I was hoping that there were going to be epic tales about guys shooting each other out of the air with crazy bow skills. Like, what is this? False advertising, bro. I thought we were going to talk about a warrior who was absolutely amazing. But I want to point out to you that this story ends by explaining that Yorinobu was one of the greatest warriors of that time. And Yorinobu's name was so powerful that thus it was said that even his children and his grandchildren were stalwart, amazing warriors. Now, why would they say this? There was no fighting. But if any of you guys are familiar with Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which was a work on warfare written thousands of years ago in ancient China, and the ancient Chinese had a massive influence on ancient Japanese society. And so the warriors of the time were very, very concerned with, when they waged war, doing so according to the art of war that was written by Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu says that the greatest warriors, the greatest generals, were not those who could conquer by destroying their enemies. In fact, the mark of a truly great warrior was one who could conquer his enemies and make them capitulate without shedding any blood, without spending any money, without fielding any armies, just by their sheer presence, their cunning, their wit, their diplomacy, their spy networks, and all of these other things besides brute force could make his enemy capitulate. That was the true mark of a great warrior. And that is exactly what Minamoto no Yorinobu did. He conquered his enemy, not by bloodshed, not by destroying infrastructure and crops and innocent civilians, but by fielding an army so big and gathering intelligence so well that he was able to make it impossible for his enemy to win, and thus securing the victory for himself. And that is why Yorinobu was known to be one of the greatest warriors, and that is why the court relied on him, and that is why he has a story in this collection of folk tales. Okay, so that is going to be the end of the story. Again, a little bit different than what you may have expected, but part of the reason why I'm doing this is so I can convey to you classical Japanese culture, as well as just the stories. I want you to be able to understand how these people thought and why they had these stories. Now, I'm never going to perfectly be able to explain to you what exactly they thought or why they thought the way that they thought, because I myself, I am a modern Westerner, so there will always be a barrier there. But the more we look into it, the more we can see that we have many things in common with them, as well as many, many things that are very, very different. So, if you enjoyed this story, please give the video a like. If you want to stay informed for when new stories drop, because we have a new one every week, please subscribe to the channel. And please share this with your friends, share this with your samurai nerd friends, share this with your weeb friends, with your history friends, share this with your storytelling friends. Just get the word out there. But if you're still listening all the way up until this point, I want to thank you sincerely from the bottom of my heart. Ito katejike no koso haberikere, and hopefully we will see you in the next one. See you later, guys.